So what I'm going to discuss tonight is what constitutes an effective wayfinding system. So there's going to be a bit of a nuts and bolts, so some bit of detail in there, and I'll take you through some case studies that talk about some of the principles of wayfinding and a bit about the process of how we do things. Okay, so when I was researching this talk, I thought, well, how do I kind of describe wayfinding in a very succinct way? And this was the best definition I was able to sort of find or come up with. So essentially is like a structured number of decisions that lead you to a destination. That little diagram pretty much summarises what it's all about. So essentially you have a start point and an end point, and along the way you have a series of decision points and confirmation points. So that's boiling it down to the fundamentals of what wayfinding is. What I'll do now is I'll just take you through some of the principles that we work to. They're sort of fairly universally recognised as what the principles of what constitutes great wayfinding. The first principle is it's very important to actually create an identity at each location that differs from all the other locations. The reason this is important is that as people, we tend to sort of form subconscious mental maps of spaces. And so by creating identities at locations, we're better able to form these mental maps and recall them. And so hence making the wayfinding process a lot more intuitive. What I'll run through here is just some examples of some projects where we've actually, to demonstrate this notion of creating different identities at locations. So this is a project that we completed recently for Qantas at their new headquarters at Mascot. They recently refurbished their site. It was a series of 4 or 5 buildings. And our role was to actually kind of create a wayfinding system for this quite extensive campus. And so what we felt was important is because it was quite a large space, we felt it was important to kind of create these identities for the different buildings, so producing very large-scale elements that could be seen along the landscape, allowing it very easy for the visitors and users of the space to orient themselves. Another project we did in South Australia for SA Water. This is a little more playful, and it wasn't strictly a wayfinding process, but it was more to kind of create a different sort of ambience or feeling in the various spaces that helped again produce mental maps for people and get a sense of place for those different spaces. Principle number 2, creating landmarks that provide orientation cues and memorable locations. It's obviously very important as part of that mental map process is to create elements that are memorable. This is a project that we did a couple of years ago for the City of Sydney, and it was creating a device that could be used as a sort of symbol for Chinatown here in Sydney. We worked with a Chinese paper card artist to actually develop the graphics for this element because we wanted to have authenticity. It would have been very easy for a graphic designer to come up with a graphic, a generic graphic, but we felt that in order to give it a lot more resonance and strength, to actually work with a collaborator who understood the culture would actually provide a much more powerful statement. This was an installation that we did for one of our clients down in Canberra, and we actually worked again with an artist on this project. These are called ocelots, and they actually are symbolic of migratory whales. And this is essentially a placemaking element that's actually open, visible from outside, and almost it becomes a bit of an icon for the building. Central Park, down here at Broadway, creating quite a memorable statement along Broadway that could be easily recognised from quite a long distance. Again, creating a memorable location. Recently we completed this project for one of our clients, Goodman. They wanted to activate a greenfield site, and we came up with some innovative ideas of how you could do that. These elements are something like about 15-20 metres high at the intersection of the M5 and the M7. So kind of creating elements like that can kind of really create some landmarks and actually help people remember where the spaces are. Another project for ANZ, for their new headquarters here in Sydney. This was an installation where, again, we worked very closely with the architects and interior designers to create a memorable element that was over 5 stories high in the atrium space. Again, kind of creating a subliminal, subconscious element within the landscape or within the building. So wayfinding doesn't need to be an actual sign. It can be a gesture in the landscape that helps form these mental maps. Creating structured paths that are easy to understand. I mean, that seems fairly obvious, but you'll be surprised how often they don't get those things right. This is a project that we did for the Powerhouse Museum a few years ago. Again, creating very easy to understand pathways so people can navigate the spaces. These are some other samples or examples that I found which I think represent that notion very well. So you can do it with colour, strong elements, strong iconography. You don't always need words. Simplifying the navigational choices. Now, I'm a stickler for having things boiled down to their absolute minimum. I think it's absolutely necessary that you don't want to confuse people. So having the navigational choices simplified for users will assist in helping find people wayfinding. So a couple of examples here. The one on the left is a project that we did a couple of years back for the National Trust. Just very, very simple information and assists in the wayfinding process. Creating areas of differing visual character. Now, again, that's a critical element in helping the wayfinding process. This is a project that we completed a couple of years ago for the Commonwealth Bank down in Melbourne. Again, another example of collaboration where we actually worked with an artist to kind of create these elements in the space, working very closely with the interior designers to actually couple the design and the colours and the solutions with the interior fit out was also key to kind of creating elements within the space that help people find their way around. Another example, a project that we did a few years back for American Express. So this was a much more subtle fit out, and therefore the wayfinding and the graphics and signage needed to be of a similar character. But you can see, you can emphasise and tone up and tone down the spaces to suit the environment. Provide the users with a map, particularly if an area is complex and large. This is a map that we created for the signage that is slowly being rolled out for UTS down here in Sydney. A critical aspect with mapping is that it's very important that mapping is always oriented with the way a user is standing. So if they're standing in front of a map, I think it's called heads up. So if you're facing that way, you want the map to be facing that way. You don't necessarily want to have mapping like they used to do it, where it was north at the top, but it didn't necessarily relate to where you're standing. Obviously, much more intuitive if the map is actually facing the way you're standing. Also, always include a "you are here" marker, because that also helps you orient yourself and align yourself with where you're facing. Locating signage at decision points. Now, that's very important because you really want information when you need it, and when you need it is where you need to make a decision. A couple of projects here. One on the left was the Powerhouse Museum, and the one on the right was for headquarters for ResMed. Now, usually decision points are located either at the top or at the bottom of stairs or at junction points, so always locate signs in those areas. Also, when you're looking at placing signs in decision points, always consider, the first thing, should there actually be a sign here? Because very often when you look at a space, sometimes there's far too much signage, and that is actually counterintuitive to helping find your way around. So I believe that really interrogate that. Do you really need a sign there? And also, what information should be included? I mean, really you only need what the user needs at that particular point. If there's a destination that's half a kilometre down the road, they don't need to know that. They only need to know what's on the next decision point so they can move from one decision point to another. So that's an important principle in finding your way. Establish clear sight lines to aid navigation. Now, obviously when you're working with good architecture, the architecture that's well considered, you can really reduce the number of signage that you need to insert in a space. But when you're working with perhaps older buildings that, for example, the Powerhouse Museum that we worked on a few years ago, that was essentially an old power station, so there was a whole lot of small spaces that you really needed put a lot of signage in there to help people find their way around. An example here of establishing clear sightlines. This was some signage we did a few years back for the exhibition centre here at Darling Harbour, which is no longer there now. But being able to actually look and be able to see where you're heading, and perhaps even see signs so you actually can navigate from one point to another, and using elements like colour and large-scale elements and typography to help the navigational process. This is a project that we did a couple of years ago for Qantas. So we developed the next generation check-in signage system. And obviously this was a huge innovation for Qantas, and it resulted in a 90% improvement in check-in times in the Sydney terminal. And as you can see, all the signs are very clear because they're a bright red. And the principle we used here is essentially the predominant colour in the airport terminal was white. And what we wanted to use is we wanted to use the same proportion of colour that is used on a Qantas plane, which is the red tail with the white body. That same principle we brought into the space where you had these red totems in a predominantly white field that then stood out and helped people understand how they needed to navigate their way around the space. Provide a universal visual language that is understood by all. Now, I am a proponent of this principle because I think that very often a lot of signage designers get this wrong. Now, there is an internationally recognised pictogram language that is understood by a wide audience, and I believe that pictograms are a very simple way of actually crossing all those sorts of boundaries. Now, I'm going to use an example to demonstrate this particular principle. There's no one here from Transport New South Wales I'm going to offend? No? Okay, good. So I can speak freely. So this is the system that's currently being rolled out by Transport for New South Wales for our public transport system. And they had the genius idea that perhaps we should just use letters to denote modes of transport. I don't know about you, but for me, this doesn't necessarily fit with principle number 9 of the wayfinding process. So can anybody tell me what these symbols mean? I mean, you probably could guess, but put yourself in the shoes of someone who does not speak English or who doesn't understand the Roman Latin alphabet. How do they find a mode of transport with this particular system? It's impossible, isn't it? What I believe they should have done is that. In their defence, though, they have used some of this iconography on other aspects of the sign, but there are certain signs, like light rail stations, where I drove past one the other day at Leichhardt, and there was just a big L sticking out the side. And it's like, what does that mean? You know, like, anyway. So that's just a way of illustrating that particular principle. Assume everybody is a first-time visitor. Now, a few years ago, I was travelling in Japan. I was actually going to visit my karate master, and I had to actually navigate my way across Tokyo. So I was staying all the way on one side of Tokyo, and his dojo, his training hall, was all the way on the other side of Tokyo. And that particular experience made me realise how important effective wayfinding is, because there was no time in my life where I actually felt more alienated or isolated in an environment than I did at that time, because at that time there was virtually no English at all. No one, obviously there was no one to ask. But I was still able to find my way across town because the signage on the Tokyo subway system is so intuitive. There's mapping at every station. All the touch points, from the physical maps you get, the handheld maps, to the ones that are on the platforms, to the ones that are on the trains, are all exactly the same. So I was able to count the number of stops on my map because I knew where I started from and I knew where I had to end. And I could literally just count how many stops I could go. And because when I was on the carriage, the dots, the colour would illuminate. So something which was very intuitive like that, I didn't need any language. And I was able to actually find my way across town in a very, very seamless and smooth way. So that to me really kind of resonated and made me realise that if you actually are doing your job well, you can actually help people find their way around without any words. Designed for the broadest audience possible. By this I mean considering all sorts of groups, so people that are able-bodied, people that are blind, people that are deaf, people that might have particular situational issues where they might be, stressed, or there might be a parent with a child in a pram, or there might be ambulatory issues, the people, disabled and in a wheelchair. You need to consider all these aspects when you're designing wayfinding, because not everybody has 2 good arms and 2 good legs and 2 eyes. So you really need to be a lot broader in your considerations of what you allow for. What I'm going to go through now is a bit of a process of what we use when we actually develop wayfinding systems. Obviously, the first thing is actually defining the problem. So, nice little quote there by Charles. If you can define what the problem is, I think you're most definitely on your way to actually solving the problem. And I think that principle actually applies to any type of design process. I think if you understand what the problem is, I think, and you can actually form it in a statement, I think you're actually on the right path to solving it. So what we do when we actually define the problem is we actually ask ourselves, what actually is the real problem? Because very often when we get a brief from a client, they might think they know what the problem is, but that might not necessarily be the problem. So you really need to define that for yourself. And then what are related problems? Because very often situations are quite complex and you really need to have a broad understanding of whether there are other problems that relate to the main problem. And is there anything unique about the particular situation that you're trying to solve? I believe that every project or every problem that we need to solve has its own unique ideal solution. And I think that part of using kind of strong creative thinking is being able to find what is unique about each of those particular problems or each of those particular projects that you're trying to solve, and bring to those projects a unique take on them. And I think that that's how you can actually kind of create innovative and groundbreaking solutions, rather than applying a sort of a cookie cutter approach to a problem that you think you can just roll it out for everyone, because every problem is unique. And I think getting to the heart of what the issue is and what the problem is will result in a far better outcome. This is a stickler, but I think these days you really need to sort of consider it. What is the budget? I'm coming across a lot of this lately on projects where, when we're actually designing concepts, we really need to actually come to the table with budgets. Very often we can't even present concepts to our clients unless they know how much it's going to cost. So always have an understanding of budget in the back of your mind. Timeline, of course, that goes without saying. The next point of the process is actually gathering the information. So obviously this is the fun part where we really do all our learnings and we kind of start to sort of really get our teeth into the problem. Who are the users? How will they use the site? What will their movement patterns? How are they approaching from which side? What time of the day? How they access the site? And does the architecture help in the wayfinding process? Now we're working on a project at the moment down at Barangaroo on the towers, and those buildings are very, very well and very rationally designed. So the actual architecture is very intuitive, and it makes the wayfinding process a lot more simplified. So it's a lot easier for a wayfinding designer to work within an environment where the architecture is well assembled. Oops. And will branding influence the design? But very often we're working on projects where we need to really consider what the brand of the organisation that we're designing for will bring to the project. So is that going to impact on what the form of the system looks like? Is it going to impact on typography that we're using? Is it going to impact on colours? All those sorts of things you really need to kind of have an understanding of before you undertake that. And very often, a good practice is actually benchmarking, what is world's best practice, what's happening out there, learning from other people's experiences, understanding that and bringing that to the table for your clients. And then analysing the data. So considering, what are all the requirements of the users? What do they require? What times and places do problems occur on sites? Because obviously different times of the day have, in the morning or in the evening or the middle of the day. Very often you'll find that, you are going to have different situations. So a project recently working on for Westfields in Miranda, where we had to activate the car parks. Miranda's a very large, I don't know if anybody knows the Miranda Shopping Centre complex, but it's a very, very large site. And covers almost a kilometre in distance. And there are 7 different car parks. And so we had to activate the car park spaces. And what we did is we did a lot of research at different times of the day where we actually spent some time in the car parks and actually spoke to users. And in the morning, in the middle of the day, in the evening, at different times of the day, so that we understood what were the requirements of those clients and those users, so that when we came up with our solutions, they were grounded in actual requirements. And also using the appropriate nomenclature. So what kind of language is appropriate for your users? If you're designing something which is meant to be a fun space, can the language be a lot more, the tone of voice be a lot more casual? If you're designing for a corporate space, does it need to be more formal? Understanding all of that is also quite an important aspect. And of course, language requirements. Do you need to have signage which is bilingual or trilingual? Do you need to consider that, particularly if your audience is not English speaking? And then, of course, defining what are the KPIs for the program. What will the client determine is successful for them for what you're doing? And then we developed the wayfinding strategy. So wayfinding strategy, there's usually 4 sort of accepted strategy models that we actually organise wayfinding systems. And these are connectors, districts, landmarks and streets. Now, these particular strategy models have as their origin quite historic urban landscape models. Now, the connector model has as its origin the Forbidden City of Beijing. Now, it has a very sort of strong axis that runs through the whole site with a lot of concentric gateways that you can move through. So it's actually quite easy to sort of find your way through the site. The districts model, so an example of this is Cambridge in the UK. Now, Cambridge evolved over a number of centuries in a very organic way. And as a way of actually helping people find their way around those spaces, they adopted a system of precincts that sort of helped people find their way with different coats of arms and different district names. So that particular model is a model that has influenced how we look at wayfinding. The landmarks model, now I was quite intrigued, I was doing a bit of research on this particular model of wayfinding. So back probably in the 14th century, one of the popes, Pope Sixtus IV, he kind of wanted to kind of create a much more grander expression of Rome that would actually epitomise the Roman Empire. So what he did is he actually went about relocating a whole lot of these ancient Egyptian obelisks that were actually randomly positioned around Rome. And what he did is he repositioned them so they created very strong axial roads around Rome. And in fact, a couple of them actually align with the winter solstice. So the one that's actually located in the middle of St. Peter's Square and it locates with another one that's further across the other side of Rome. And so by creating these strong axial points, they're able to kind of create major landmarks, civic landmarks within the landscape. And this particular model is used quite often in wayfinding. And then of course the final model is the streets model, which New York adopted in the early 18th century. And that is essentially a sequentially numbered grid of streets. And so we use that in wayfinding. So I've just sort of simplified those 4 models into how we actually use those particular models in wayfinding. So, for example, if you were signing a hospital as an example, you could use 4 approaches like this. So you could have a connector model where you have essentially a ring road, a major pathway that you actually help people navigate using that major ring road. Or perhaps you could use a districts model like the Cambridge model where you have 4 different buildings and you actually name them different, whether it be East Wing or whether you actually give them a name. Then there's the landmarks model, which is reminiscent of Rome, where perhaps you have certain points where people are making decisions where you can kind of create landmarks. And that usually in public buildings there are things like lifts or lift wells where you can kind of direct people to, or particular corridors. And then finally the streets model, which New York used, where you could adapt that for a hospital where you actually name the streets or the main thoroughfares that you move around the space. So that kind of gives you a sense of how something which is historical, like some of those historical examples, have now informed wayfinding strategy. And when we actually look at solving problems for our clients, we look at which one of these particular models is most appropriate for the spaces and the buildings. The next step is obviously planning the signage. So when we actually plan signage, we actually look at the 4 types of signage categories. So in most cases there are 4 types, and there's usually identification signage, directional signage, orientation signage, and regulatory signage. So just some examples of this, and these vary in scale to the LAX example, which is a huge sort of precinct scale, down to a building identification sign, which could be either a number or a name. Directional signage, and again this can take many forms. It doesn't need to be just a sign or a signpost. It can be something which is quite architectural. It can be something which is actually quite beautifully crafted and works in with the architecture, or something which is sort of very practical, like the New York subway, where you have a very particularly strong architectural gesture that makes it very, very easy for people to navigate. Orientation. So orientation can take the form of either mapping or things like directories or level directories. So orientation is obviously an important aspect of wayfinding. And finally, regulatory. So these are the things you kind of really have to have. You're regulated by law. Things like fire hose reel signs or no smoking signs or those sorts of things. So they're pretty much the 4 categories of signs that you kind of work with. And then the fun part starts for us designers, is actually designing the physical forms. So when we look at designing the physical forms, we obviously look at how it relates to the context. So I'm a big believer that wayfinding should be integrated with the spaces. So really kind of taking architectural and interior design cues that inform what you're doing with the forms of the signage. Consider how many types are required. So do you need all those 4 types, or can you do certain buildings not require that many? Usability is obviously a very important thing. So how is it going to be used? How is the sign going to be used? Is it appropriate to the spaces? Do you need to consider users in respect of how it's going to be used, and all that sort of thing? And then, do you require sort of dynamic signage? Does it need to have electronics? Does it need to have integration with apps and that type of thing? Do you need monitors? Another thing that we also kind of refer to when we're designing sign forms is actually kind of being a lot more responsible with the use of materials. And I guess this sort of talks to things like kind of developing a more proportional system that maximises material sizes. And very often, most materials that we work with come in a standard sheet size, the old 8x4, 1200 by 2400. And I find it's very appropriate to kind of use that particular dimension to actually maximise your materiality. So you're not actually having to throw away material when you're developing systems. And then that kind of lends itself to creating a very modular system, which is all based on those particular proportions that come out of material sheet sizes. So the example you see there is a more simplified version of what we did at Qantas for their headquarters. So we had the large letters that I showed you up front, where they were sort of 2400 high elements. Then we had the various sort of directional totems. Then we had suspended signs that were within the building themselves that help people find their way around. And then obviously things like regulatory signs and fire hose and identification signs. And you can see how you can start to create a very cohesive signage family where everything kind of relates to one another and everything becomes very harmonious because you've actually kind of considered how all the elements speak to one another. And then designing the graphics, so the actual communication, how do you actually pull that together? This is a chart that's readily available online. This is what we normally refer to when we're looking at what is the appropriate size of lettering to be read. So the normal rule of thumb is for every 10 millimetres of letter height, it equates to 3 metres of viewing distance. So yeah, this particular one is erring on the side of caution. There are some out there that are a lot smaller. As I get older, I kind of increase the numbers. You should see the size of my text on my iPhone. So yeah, so this is something that you really need to sort of consider. And then choosing the appropriate typefaces for signage. So the two things that I kind of look at is selecting a font which actually has a tall X height. So for example, the example on the right, Helvetica, the proportion of the X height to the ascenders and descenders is quite high. That allows you to have lettering quite large on signs. You're not having the ascenders and descenders of lines bumping into one another, so you're able to get a much larger message. And then having also a font which actually has large counters or large spaces, which actually makes it a lot easier to comprehend. There's been a font that's recently been designed called Wayfinding Sans, which actually takes a lot of these principles into account and helps the legibility aspect. So legibility is obviously an important aspect. And some of the things that we obviously consider is the character of the architecture, and I've touched upon this. The brand of the organisation, and that can affect the typeface selection. Clarity and legibility, I've touched upon that. That's obviously quite an important aspect. And also, international recognition. There's a lot of typefaces that are suited to different countries. For example, the London Underground uses a font which has quite long ascenders and descenders, and quite, that's appropriate for the English language. But then if you were to use that particular font for example, the German language, the very open characters are not appropriate for long messages. So you've got to consider all these types of things. And also timelessness. I mean, when we're designing signing systems, we kind of look at them being around for quite a number of years, at least 10 years, let's just use as a sort of a rule of thumb. So, you don't want it to be something that sort of ages and doesn't look appropriate, because at the end of the day, you almost need to look at it almost like a piece of the architecture. And if the building's been designed to have longevity, I believe that the wayfinding and signage system should as well. This is where it gets really hardcore, so I'll test you at the end of the night. So this is the science of colour, and again, this is how we kind of look at what is appropriate for legibility. So most colours have what's called a light reflectance value, so understanding contrast and how much light sort of bounces off. So when we look at designing signs, we look at the difference between the foreground and background colour. Now, hold on to your hats because the next slide's going to freak you out a bit. I won't dwell on it too much, but suffice to say there's a bit of science behind it, and what we aim for is for at least a 70% contrast between the foreground and background. So the example on the right, black text on red, only gives you a 38% contrast value, whereas the white on the red gives you an 84% contrast value, and world's best practice is around 70%. So if you can kind of stick to around 70%, you're kind of fulfilling most of the accessibility requirements. And then there's things like, what's the most appropriate way to align arrows on signs? So usually we use start at 12 o'clock and work your way around the clock. And that's sort of a general principle for how you work with hierarchy. And then obviously layout is very important. And we usually use quite a structured grid when we're aligning information. So usually we have a zone for typography, a zone for pictograms, and a zone for arrows. And that allows you to group the information in a very logical way and help you find your way around. And then finally implementing the system. So putting together drawings and manufacturing specifications, message schedules, so helping people understand what goes on all the signs, and then locating all the signs on master plans. And then finally working with some trusted suppliers, people who will come through for you and do a great job. And then obviously we do a lot of prototyping. So as part of the process of what we do, we test things. So that's sort of, I guess, speaks back to sort of the design thinking process of where you actually need to test what you do before you kind of roll out the final product. And then revising it, learn from what the prototype tells you, and then supervise the manufacturer, and then finally do an inspection. And then finally, evaluate the results and make sure that you evaluate what you've done after a period of time, get feedback from staff and get big feedback from users, and then identify what works and doesn't work, and then finally fix it. So I've come to the end of my talk for tonight, but if there's just 3 things that you might want to take away with you as sort of the must-dos of wayfinding: creating landmarks at key locations, simplifying the journey and providing navigational tools, and also designing for first-time users so you capture the broadest audience. Thank you. The project that we recently completed for Westfield and Miranda, we actually conducted an actual series of tests where we actually went through at different times of the day and we interviewed all the users on site and got all their feedback, so that when we went back and pulled together our designs, they were actually bedded in real information that we got. So that really was a helpful exercise in helping understand and putting ourselves in the shoes of the users, because you might come to the table with what you think is appropriate, what you think is right, but until you actually speak to your users and people, the customers who are going to be experiencing the space and using the space, you really are just guessing. And I think that you really need to sort of understand that. I mean, it's sort of integral to what we do. I mean, you can't design in isolation. You really need to understand, what are the requirements, what are the real requirements of the users, because there's no point designing something if it's ineffective or inappropriate or it's not going to work. And so the particular process of understanding the user's viewpoint is something that we've adhered to from day one in our design process. And I know that user experience has become a very fashionable term in recent years, but as designers, we've always considered the users. If you're going to design a new type of pen or a new type of mouse, of course you're going to do a whole lot of exhaustive tests to make sure that what you put out there is going to be effective, it is going to be useful. So yeah, I mean, it's a critical part of the design process. Yep. I can use a couple of examples. One of the examples was the wayfinding system that we developed for the UTS campus. Now, obviously, that's quite a big campus, and so when we developed the signage system, we actually pulled together one-to-one models, one-to-one paper models, and took them out onto site and tested them in situ. Because what I've discovered, obviously, with wayfinding is that you might design something on the screen, or you might print it out and stick it up on the wall in the studio, and you think, well, that looks good, I can read that. But until you actually go down on site, you put it in situ where it's going to go, and you kind of understand the spatial particulars. It's only then that you realise, is it actually appropriate? Does it work? And so very often what we'll do is we'll do simple things like paper models, but then if we want to understand the physical form, with the Qantas NextGen project, we actually got an actual real model made. And therefore we were able to sort of iron out all those construction issues of how it should come together. What's the most appropriate way to build it? What's the most efficient way to build it? And so we look at all those things. We don't look at just whether the sign will function, whether it'll read, but what's the best way to make it? What's going to be the most efficient way to do it? So there's lots of those things that we look at to help inform it. But it's critical to the whole design process. And very often it's very illuminating, because you actually can make adjustments and make things work better. Yeah, look, that's a good question. Look, I mean, obviously, there's lots of new Australian standards that are coming in. There's one that's actually coming out, well, actually that's been journaled now. I think it's 1428.9. I think it is. Is it? Yes. There's a few in there. So look, I think that we obviously need to be aware of what are the requirements, of people with disabilities. So I mean, a lot of those things that I covered in there are what is kind of regarded as best practice. Obviously, with digital technology, that's obviously going to come into play a lot more, I believe, with wayfinding, where you actually are able to kind of tailor the information for the specific user. I see that becoming a lot more prevalent, in the wayfinding process, and certainly we'll be able to cater a lot more to people with disabilities, I believe. Yeah.